Going live. This one looked interesting.
Each episode, we examine the intersection of finance, economics, technology, and geopolitics, connecting the dots between the events shaping our world.
And Sebastian, it looks like you're back in London this week, correct?
Yep, I'm back on home turf, makes a change. No travel for at least about 5 days, so that's nice.
That is nice. Well, same here. And as much as I'm always happy to be home with my family, my cat, my comfy bed, I have to say I still appreciate getting out on the road. I always feel like I learn more face-to-face with people, just kind of checking things out on the ground.
You could try the old, George W. Bush trip. When he went on the road for the campaign, he brought his own pillow with him, and that made him feel okay. But no, I feel the same. I was recording this spillover last week in Boise, Idaho, a city distinguished mostly by the presence of Micron, the main, I think only actually, semiconductor maker who actually makes the chips in the US. Maybe Intel is there now as well, but for a long time, Micron was the only one. And I was speaking in a room, which I went to after recording with you, and the view was of a blue American football pitch. And I was told that this was the first blue turf in the whole of college football. And so I learned about an important piece of American culture, which I didn't know about before.
So you were in Boise with a blue pitch, and I think it's the Broncos. So you've got 3 Bs there, and you know I love alliterations. But Sebastian, this week, we're going to go with a different letter. And
Skip
coefficients.
The small talk.
We're just talking about a gap or a challenge.
You know, that Boise field is cool. Let's see. Boise football. Just take a look at what they were joking about real quick. Yeah, it's badass looking.
For one part of the K or the other, we're not talking about these things actually accelerating in 2 different directions.
Yeah, so we're homing in on things where the K is actually, extending and the 2 parts of society are growing further apart.
Okay, great. So we're on the same page. K is about a widening divide between the haves and have-nots, if you will. But then there's the next issue. Like, what do those 2 prongs of the K refer to?
K economy, for those that don't know, is our current economy. We've had it since the 70s. Let's see, actually. Let's get the pay production K chart. Let's see if it's works. Oh, no, it's not even close. Pay production divergence. There we go. This is a K economy. Pay has stagnated. I guess these show a couple different things. Oh yeah, I guess they all have the same dip. I didn't even realize that the actual but basically wages have basically broken even against inflation since the 1970s, while productivity has gone way up. This is all on paid labor. Even this is actually was on paid labor. These things were on chart, but there was on paid labor here. All surplus goes to the top. It's all unpaid labor. That's a K economy. What we have 2 simultaneous economies at the same time. That's why the economy, people people in the State Departments or in the the Fed and politicians campaigning, they are saying how the economy is so good, and it doesn't feel that way on the ground. That's because they are talking about a different economy. They don't know it. We have 2 simultaneous economies right now. We're in the bottom part.
So are we measuring income? Are we measuring wealth, consumption, some combo? Is it pre or post tax? I've seen some people measure it pre and post fiscal transfers. And one of the challenges with this is that whatever choice you make in your definition, your methodology, you're going to have very different results. And that's even before we get into the quality of the data, which have been questioned, especially I think on the top end of the K, the upper income, if you will, or the wealthier households, especially if you have some of those high income earners who either don't always clearly report everything they're spending or everything they're making, maybe for tax or other reasons. And Sebastian, there's an example I want to point to here that's been cited a lot and I think kind of highlights what we're talking about. Mark Zandi is the chief economist at Moody's Analytics. He's someone I respect very deeply. He's a very credible economist. His analysis suggested that the top 10% of American income earners account for about half of all consumer spending in the U.S. That's a huge number. And
it's a ridiculous number. 10% of people should not be consuming half of everything in the United States. That means the other 90% together are getting what the top 10% are getting. I guess that's an obvious statement, but that's insane.
It's striking. It gets quoted all the time. People refer to it. They don't even cite them anymore. But then you have the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which is government data, gold star data, also very credible. And they come up with the same question, and the number's 23% instead of Zandy's 50%. So you could drive a truck through the difference in that. And it's all about the methodology and the data they use. The BLS is looking at household surveys, and the people self-report. So that might skew, right? Especially at the top end. And then Mark Zandy is using Federal Reserve data. And without getting in the weeds, it requires him to do some colorful math and back into his answer. So the truth is probably somewhere in the middle between 23 and 50%. But again, it just highlights that you can have legitimate studies out there about the K, about inequality, equality, about these issues, and get different responses.
Right. And, I mean, that's
the important thing is though, we're in a K economy. It doesn't matter what the actual numbers are. If it's like, 50%, 23% or whatever it is. We're in a K economy. We have two simultaneous economies, and it's all the people at the top who don't do anything. They don't produce anything. They just have the legal rights to the capital, and everyone else is doing all the work, and everyone else is producing everything. And the people at the top just get all the surplus value. Doesn't matter what the percentages are. Our elites are screwing us, and our elites didn't earn their way to the top. They inherited their way into it. I mean, Google was a good idea once. Facebook never was. IBM, or not IBM. IBM used to actually be good, but now it's kind of fallen off. But Microsoft has always been second best at everything. I mean, Word was like the second best word processor. Internet Explorer wasn't as good as Netscape Navigator. You can go on and on and on about everything. And compared to Apple, if they failed, they failed at search engines, they failed at like everything, but it's just having that chokehold. By the time the lawsuits are Microsoft ripped off Apple, there's a lawsuit. It takes like 3 years for the litigation to start. Bill Gates was already the richest man in the world by that point. And then he had the money to basically bankrupt Apple, and they end up cutting a deal. Facebook was never Tesla, what's his name? Elon Musk gets in sideways. Facebook was never a good idea at all. It wasn't original. Amazon's bookstore, that started as a bookstore, wasn't better than Barnes & Noble. It was able to avoid taxes. Uber, it's all these things. These are elites. They didn't create anything. They didn't do anything better. They just control the system.
A huge grab, as you say, but that's really about the top end of the distribution. And you also get some uncertainty and debate around the bottom end of the distribution. I mean, people talk about the affordability crisis as though the bottom part of that K is heading downwards and things are getting worse. On the other hand, there's quite a lot of credible people who look at the data. I mean, The Economist magazine did a good review of this back in December and argue that this whole notion that the less well-off are getting worse off is a statistical fiction. That really, yes, there was an inflation shock. People were upset about the cost of living, but real wages adjusted for inflation were actually doing fine. And I think actually the data basically do support that view. If you go back to 2019, you look at the cumulative wage rises in the US through 2024, and you adjust for the inflation.
We've been getting screwed since the 70s.
The bottom has actually seen more gains than the top. I mean, the Economic Policy Institute, which is a sort of...
Yeah, that's a bunch of BS too.
Progressive.
Economics is kind of BS, honestly.
Labor union affiliated think tank put out a report saying that the hourly wage for the lowest paid workers of the bottom 10% grew 15.3% over this period. In other words, 2019 to 2024. So 15.3% cumulative.
The jobs are getting cut in the way they keep job statistics. Like, these numbers probably are true numbers, but they don't tell the whole story.
After inflation. So that's really a big gain. And so what that means is that for most of the recent past, at least the period in which this K-shaped discussion has arisen, the real inflation adjusted wages at the bottom of society have done fine. They haven't supported the K-shaped story. In fact, they've contradicted it. And that raises an interesting question, which is, why do people believe the story, even if the data aren't with it? I mean, the New York Times, pretty much in the same week as that Economist piece I referenced back in December, came out with a long article stressing how a lot of Americans were having to trade down to lower versions of the goods they like to buy. They were financing holiday purchases based on credit cards, while the wealthy were still spending confidently. And I think what this points you to is a divergence sometimes between wage trends on the one hand and consumption trends on the other, especially when there is an economic shock, which COVID obviously was. So in the face of the shock, the rich can basically draw on savings and carry on buying whatever they used to buy before. They might even actually consume more because they're sort of cushioning themselves from the shock of COVID. I mean, I'd say that in my own family's case, when going into COVID, we didn't own a car. We used to take the train.
But then, this is basically BS. I thought they were actually going to be honestly talking about the K economy. They're arguing against the K economy. We're not wrong. The way it feels is true. Let's see. This one looked interesting.
Welcome back, Defenders.
This is kind
Remember
of a
my last
clickbaity
video how I
title.
said
This
I
guy
was
was
sad
just
that the
clickbaity stuff.
Tuapse oil refinery fire had finally gone out. Fire brought under control at Russia's Tuapse oil terminal. Well, Ukraine decided to cheer me up, and they struck it again. Finishing off Russia's seaborne oil exports, the Tuapse refinery is ablaze again. The Russian Black Sea export terminal's refinery burns again, 4 days after Russia extinguished the last fire from the April 20th strike. So I think I understand what's happening here. One, Russia cannot defend this facility, given its proximity to the Black Sea coastline Ukraine can just sail their drones over the Black Sea the entire distance, and there's just not enough time, not enough warning for Russia to shoot down these drones. In addition, this complex is interesting because this is the refinery up here. Ukraine has not been striking the refinery for the last 2 weeks. They've been striking the export terminal. So Russia pumps in crude oil, refines it into gasoline, diesel, whatever. They then store it here and load it onto ships. So for the last 2 weeks, Ukraine has been focusing on these storage tanks for the export terminal so that ships cannot load. Russia cannot load up and then sell their gasoline or refined oil products for a profit around the world. And this was very smart, because if you destroy the loading terminal, there's nothing to refine. You cannot refine if there's nowhere to store it. Maybe Russia could continue refining and then pump it the other direction to use it domestically or something, but Ukraine for the last 2 weeks first went after the storage tanks for the export terminal, and now they're going after the refinery proper. This is brutal. So here's a low-resolution satellite images from yesterday.
A badass
This
picture.
is the damage to the export part of this complex, and now they're going after the refinery proper. This is an early morning picture, so I'm guessing these drones went in during the nighttime. This is what the fire looked like in the morning, and then this is what the fire looked like later in the day. This is massive. So once again, this is the actual refinery part of the complex. It was struck by, I don't know, it looks like at least 4 or 5 drones, and the fire is consuming the complex. It's continuing to spread. This is massive, guys. Like, this looks fake. This fire is so big, it looks like CGI. There's nothing Russia can do to put this out. So Putin has gone missing. Anytime there's a national catastrophe in the country of Russia, Putin just disappears for 3 days. So he's been laying low, not making any public appearances, and this is the regional governor in Tuapse trying to make it look like the situation is under control, when it is not under control. So in my last video, I showed you the environmental damage, and I said there's guys with shovels just shoveling up on the beach, but I was wrong. This is a woman. Russia has women on the beach shoveling up crude oil. Where did all your men go, Russia? Yes, this is an environmental catastrophe. This is a disaster for the Black Sea coastline and for all the countries in the region, but Ukraine offered Russia an energy ceasefire. Ukraine for months has been saying, if Russia will just stop attacking our energy infrastructure, we'll stop attacking their energy infrastructure. And Russia doesn't want to do that. So let's update the bingo board, and we have a new special graphic for the biggest oil refinery fire ever. This place has basically been on fire for over 2 weeks now. So I think this is it for Tuapse. I don't know how you repair this. I don't know how you salvage this. I don't think they're going to be refining, and I don't think they're going to be exporting on the Black Sea from that loading terminal anymore. Let's follow up on the ships that were attacked 2 nights ago. What's left of Russia's Black Sea fleet in Crimea comes under fire as Ukraine hits 3 warships in Sevastopol.
If they're refined, they're refined, they're not pumping. I was going to make a comment about how the wells can get damaged, but it's where you're pumping, not where you're refining.
We now know the identity, but once again, Ukraine is not releasing the video. Apparently, 2 of the ships are a repeat strike from a week prior. These are the landing ships, the Yamal and the Nikolai Filchenkov. They were struck on, let's see, April 18th, and then again on the 26th. So the ships weren't sunk, they weren't completely destroyed, and they're still in the ports of Sevastopol. So Ukraine, every couple nights, they're going to just take another shot.
This guy doesn't seem to have anything. Yeah, but those are badass pictures. That was like...
Actual refinery part.
Yeah, that was one I had it. That's the second one. What is that planet?
Of this complex. And
oops. Well, no. Let's see what's going on. Oh, wait.
The United Arab Emirates says it will leave the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries from the 1st of May. This is a heavy blow for the organization at a time when the Iran war is already causing a shock to energy supplies that is reverberating around the globe. Analysts say the UAE exit represents a big win for US President Donald Trump. Mr. Trump accusing the organization of, quote, ripping off the rest of the world.
Trump has really just backed his way into like a major situation here, and it's not all bad for the U.S., but like he's just like, he's backing his way through this whole thing.
by inflating oil prices. The move comes after the UAE criticized Arab states for not doing enough to protect it from numerous Iranian attacks during this war. Oil futures up more than 3%, WTI around $100 per barrel, while Brent is at about $111 per barrel.
Oh.
And more on this story, as well as others. Philip Cornell, he's Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council's Global Energy Center, joins us live from Galle in Sri Lanka. Mr. Cornell, thanks for joining us this evening. Is this a win for Donald Trump?
Thank you, Wesu. Indeed it is. Donald Trump has been accusing OPEC of keeping prices high, even as the U.S. is, quote unquote, protecting GCC states. And so this represents really a move within the UAE of those factions inside the UAE that are arguing that the U.S. Should be.
So there are reasons to want to control the price of oil, but OPEC doesn't do it positively for anyone. It's just a cartel. It's just a monopoly. So it's good that it's breaking up. The actual theory behind it isn't actually bad. It's just kind of like a steady flow of oil going into the world rather than different market dynamics all over the place. But in this case, obviously it's good. OPEC is not a good thing. We want the different, I think there's 12 countries that are in OPEC, or 13. We want them fighting to be the lowest bidder, racing to the bottom is what that phrase is. And obviously when they're a cartel working together, they're not going to do that. And because there's no international law, we can't actually trust bus. There's no such thing as international law. We should trust bus at home. We don't do that. There's not really much law for the corporations at home either. We are post-constitutional at this point.
Going further against Iran.
We want local law, though. We want rule of law. We need to reestablish rule of law. There's no international law, though.
Really is demonstrating how the post-crisis reality will see many GCC countries, starting with the UAE and perhaps others, becoming much closer to Washington.
But if we define a win as lower oil prices for Mr. Trump, how will the pullout of the UAE get these lower prices for Donald Trump?
Well, traditionally, OPEC has been a cartel. Its job has been to put a floor under prices by organizing supply cuts in order to keep those prices higher. So in principle, as the organization weakens, there will be less incentive to keep prices cut. The reality is a little bit more complicated. The real engine inside OPEC is Saudi Arabia, which is the only country that has significant differences, let's say, the ability to pump much more, spare capacity of production. But from a political point of view, this is really a blow to OPEC and, in principle, might make it harder for them to buoy prices in the future.
All right, and final question on this before we move on. The link between U.S. support militarily for the Gulf with OPEC then controlling oil prices insofar as it can control oil prices. Both the UAE and Saudi Arabia, relative to other Gulf states, have actually been, over this war on Iran, relatively aligned with the United States. Where do you see Saudi Arabia acting on this with the UAE pulling out? Final question before we move on.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think within the GCC states, there has been some debate about their reaction to this war in general. Many have blamed the U.S., let's say, for starting it alongside Israel and causing such upheaval to their economic models, which have relied on stability and continued investment. On the other hand, there has been another faction, I think, which we can see now is more pervasive within the leadership, which has said, okay, now that this war has started, we need to, quote unquote, finish the job. And so they have been in Washington over the past month or two. The embassies of the UAE and Saudi Arabia have been going to the White House and urging them to continue and not to cut a deal that leaves Iran in charge of the strait. And so I think we can see now that
Wow, so we're seeing a major
Let's see what this guy has to say.
shakeup in the world order, and let me show you guys what's going on. Here's your headline then. UAE to leave OPEC and blow to oil cartel. You heard that correctly. UAE is out. And effectively what we're seeing again, that shakeup in the world.
Now, there are two major objections that have been drawn up, thrown at us again, again, and again. The first is it's not affordable. You can't afford that everybody has a basic income. Well, they can afford to allow the billionaires to have all their tax haven money. They can afford...
Universal basic income is not a great idea, or I don't agree with it, because you don't want to just give people money and have it spend it on whatever. It's just that ends up carrying to the top. We're better off putting the money into services. Let's build out roads. Let's build out infrastructure. If people have low-cost housing, free healthcare, access to food, food stamps, which isn't bad because they spend the food stamps then at local grocery stores and markets and stuff. It's not like you're necessarily, I mean, I guess people can order food from Amazon and they do that some, but the majority of groceries come from local grocery stores. And even if those are Albertsons or, other big stores, it's still like a local branch physical thing. So that is actually, so people having food stamps, it's not like it's like just like a drain on the economy, because it gets spent in the local economy and that filters back through, and there's taxes and incomes and that gets taxed. So instead of universal basic income, which would get spent and taxed, it's better off just putting it into things that go to people, like healthcare, food stamps, housing, low cost or cheap education. And I just think that's a better way to like fund instead of universal basic income, you want to just fund those things well. And then that creates a floor for people, and they can still go get free education and work jobs on top of that and stuff. I disagree. I do agree with the idea of like universal basic income for everyone, but I don't think it should be universal basic income. I think we should raise the floor on society: housing, clean air, clean water, food, education.
To give out £400 billion in subsidies to the wealthy and tax breaks and to the corporations. The second point is, if everybody had a basic income, they'd all become lazy and sit on their bums and not do any work. Well, I want you to watch my mouth in the next 10
The capitalist class doesn't do any work.
seconds. Every experiment that we've done with basic income has resulted in people doing more work, not less. Now, what I'm going to talk about is basic income. I don't use the term universal for reasons that I will explain. I use the term...
I think that's the point right there. So, okay, universal basic income doesn't make people lazy. Great. I think it should still be, and I'm not opposed to the theory of universal basic income. I just don't like agree with the economics of it, and I don't agree with the philosophy of it. But it is actually kind of, it's a step in the right direction, or a thought in the right direction. Society needs to look out for everyone in society. The United States needs to look out for all United States citizens. We need to clamp down things like immigration and citizenship. We shouldn't have anyone in Congress that like speaks broken English. You know, we have both parties have like people that have no business being there. We do need to kind of like restrict like who can vote, who can run for office, who can be in office. People like Donald Trump shouldn't be able to run for office or be in office either. Donald Trump is stupid so, you know, I'm trying to keep this PG so I can like not get my channel docked, but Donald Trump is Untermensch. But we want, even though we do want like a good, you know, way, and we'll have some immigration, but you know, the privileges of citizenship should be really worth a lot, and they won't be extended to everyone, but that should, you know, we should be raising the floor for everyone of the nation. And apparently, when you give people stuff, they don't get lazy and sit around and do nothing. They do more work, which, you know, especially if instead of giving them money, you're just giving them housing and education, then they can continue to do things on top of that.
Ken Martin, thanks for doing this.
Yeah, thanks for having me back on, John. It was great to see you the other night at the Grinder party of all parties. It was amazing.
I know. I wish I hadn't run out of alcohol by the time I arrived, but that's neither here nor there. Quick bit of context for listeners. This all came about because you expressed some frustration about criticism of the DNC coming from our direction. So I appreciate you coming on to talk about it directly. I'll just say up front, we share the goal of making sure Democrats win everywhere, especially the White House in 2028. I also very much understand you've got one of the hardest jobs in politics, that you took at an especially tough time for the party. But I do want to press you on some specific things because I think the stakes are too high not to. Does that sound fair?
Sounds great, John. Thank you. Appreciate it.
So I want to start with the 2024 autopsy, which you call an after-action review. When you won the chairmanship in February of 25, you criticized the DNC's refusal to release their 2016 autopsy as exactly what not to do. You said, quote, was there any utility in doing that? And then promised your 2024 autopsy would be different. Your exact quote was, of course it will be released. Why did you change your mind on that?
Well, look, I mean, what I said all along, even when I ran for this position, is that we were going to focus on the things that will help us win the upcoming election, right? Making sure that we learn the right lessons that could help inform our victories. And that's what we've done. We said this when we sent out the press release back in November saying we weren't going to release.
Both parties, this whole thing, our whole system, it's just about winning elections. It's not actually about being good in office. Both parties are not the answer.
We were going to actually keep our focus on those lessons, and we release those lessons. We continue to do that. And it's important for me, instead of navel-gazing and looking backwards and trying to relitigate 2024. I don't know about you, John, but I don't have a time machine. I don't think you do. No one does, so we can't change what happened in 24. The only thing we can do is actually change what happens in the future, including the 26 election cycle, 28 and beyond. That means we do need to learn the lessons. We need to make sure they help inform our decisions that we're making, and we've been releasing those. We released them just a couple months ago in our playbook, which if you want to look at that, go to dnc.org/playbook, and you can get an example of some of the lessons. We've been releasing releasing them with our donors and with activists and party leaders. We've been talking about what those lessons are, and we've actually been putting those lessons into action. And so it's not completely accurate to say that we didn't release that. Where we're keeping our focus is on the lessons that can actually help us win.
But on this show in August, you told me this about releasing the review, quote, "We have to do it to give people who invested so much time, energy, and money a sense of what happened and why we lost."
Correct.
Especially why we lost. So what changed between August and December? I understand there are lessons, but those are not the full report. Why not release the full report? What's in the report that you wouldn't want?
Well, first off,
publicized?
there's no smoking gun in the report, and I know that's what everyone's so eager to learn. I mean, the smoking gun. Guess what, John?
But if there's no smoking gun, why wouldn't you just release it then?
Because we want to keep the focus on the lessons. Because what ends up happening here is that people, of course, want to weaponize the report in a way to look backwards, to point fingers, place blame in a way that actually doesn't keep us focused on the upcoming election. But instead, the navel gazing of focusing backwards actually takes us backwards. We're 189 days from this election, John. What we don't need to be focused on is actually relitigating 2020.
This is The Opinions, a show that brings you a mix of voices from New York Times Opinion. You've heard the news. Here's what to make of it.
I'm David French. I'm a columnist at the New York Times, and I'm also a veteran. When I was thinking about who I could talk to about Trump's strategy in the world, with an emphasis on the current conflict in Iran, there's just a list of 2 or 3 people in the entire United States who I think would be most interesting on this topic. And one of them is General Stan McChrystal. General McChrystal is the former commander of U.S. forces in Afghanistan. He's the former head of Joint Special Operations Command. He served in Iraq when I was in Iraq. He has been called by former Secretary of Defense Robert Gates as perhaps the finest warrior and leader of men in combat I have ever met. And he's got a lot of interesting things to say about this conflict, including observations about the origin of the conflict, the challenge American forces face, the nature of the enemy that the United States is confronting, whether Israel and the United States have similar interests and goals in this conflict. And then we're going to end with a discussion of leadership and service that I think that you will find very interesting. So without further ado, here's my conversation with General McChrystal.
Say this.
There seems to be little movement on the resumption of talks between the U.S. and Iran to end the war that the Americans launched alongside Israel over 2 months ago. There's also almost no movement through the Strait of Hormuz, the vital bottleneck that's essentially cut off 20% of the world's oil and gas supply. Last week saw the fewest crossings since the war began. Today, the United Arab Emirates announced it will leave OPEC, the cartel that's largely controlled global oil supplies for decades, leading to more uncertainty and questions about when the financial pain will stop. For perspective, we're joined now by Karen Young, a political economist and senior research scholar at Columbia University. Great to see you. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So the UAE has been rumored to want to leave OPEC for some time now. Why now? Was the war in Iran the last straw?
No, I think actually this timing is probably the least disruptive because this doesn't change volumes that are going out tomorrow. The UAE can't increase its production and get to market any faster because the Strait of Hormuz is blocked, and they're at capacity for the oil that's flowing through the pipeline through Fujairah. So it doesn't change anything from a market and supply perspective. But yes, it's true. Within OPEC, the UAE had the most stringent quota based on what it had capacity to produce, and its quota was much smaller. So it's been a point of tension, particularly with neighbor Saudi Arabia, for quite some time now.
The UAE energy minister actually gave an interview to CNN International earlier today to try to explain their decision. Here's part of what he had to say.
We are totally at an uncomfortable level of inventories. That would require additional resources to fulfill it. So the world before the closure of Hormuz is different than the world today.
He was, of course, talking about global inventories and shortages there, but he seemed to be saying leaving OPEC will allow producers to ramp up production and fill the shortages. Will it?
Once the Strait of Hormuz is open, yes, and it would be helpful to see an increase in production, particularly as we have to refill the shortages that have been part of the last 2 months. But it won't be an immediate fix. And so I think that the UAE motivation is that they've wanted to expand production. They've invested about $150 billion into their oil and gas resources, and they want to produce more gas with the oil. So this is something that nobody's really talking about. The more oil that they drill offshore, there's gas associated with that oil. And there's a big demand for gas inside the UAE for electricity generation. So this falls in line with some of their domestic industrial ambitions as well.
This is about broader ambitions for the UAE than beyond just oil production.
That's right. It's for electricity generation for AI, for example. It's about their diversification agenda inside the country and able to make decisions of their partnerships, who are their consumers of oil and gas and renewables, how do they get to them. This matters a lot, I think, for their ability to supply China with oil and perhaps gas as export in the future.
Meanwhile, they are as hamstrung as anyone else to get out oil supply while that strait is closed. Talks with Iran appear to be at a stalemate. No sign of the strait reopening anytime soon. How do you look at that right now in terms of where global oil supplies are?
So this remains the largest supply shock to global oil markets and gas markets we've ever experienced. And as we get farther along into this crisis,
it's going to be interesting to see. I mean, it's interesting times we're living in. I mean, this is going to be worse than the oil shock of the 70s. Do we end up in a decade of misery? I don't think so, but we could. I mean, I don't know. Things are different. Like our whatchamacallem, our debt, our deficit is much higher now, which obviously is bad, but I feel like they actually even though they still can't run things successfully, I feel like they have things under a little more, or they have things a little bit better understood now. Of course, with that said, well, actually, it's going to be different because Jimmy Carter made a decision in the 70s that it was basically guaranteed to cost him the election, and it did. It was one of those things that was the right thing to do. George W. Bush did the same thing. And I forget exactly what Jimmy Carter did. He did something. It was the Volcker pricing. It was I forget what it was. Yeah, it's gonna take too long for me to look into it. But basically, Jimmy Carter. Anyway, like it'll be interesting compared now to the 70s. But this is a worse oil shock than happened in the 70s, and the 70s had our whole our economy was in the tank for like 10 years. It was bad.
What's happening is that we don't have that oil getting to market, about 16 million barrels a day that's absent from the Strait of Hormuz, but then countries are drawing down on their inventories. This could be strategic stockpiles or what firms and commercial entities hold. We're starting to draw into those inventories, and as we do, that means that the price has to climb, right? Because it's not being replaced, it's not being refilled. So we're going to get more price pressure as we have this kind of supply shortage, and eventually there'll be a reaction to that, and that's what we call demand destruction. And that's where we start to feel the pinch, not just in transportation, but in the fuels that are associated and made from oil, anything like naphtha or LPG, things that go into plastics, the petrochemical feedstocks, which is going to make everything we buy and use basically more expensive.
So let's be more clear on that from the consumer's point of view. Your gas prices just hit a 4-year high, right? We know consumers are already paying elevated prices, not just at the pump, but in terms of airline tickets and the food prices that they pay, in terms of the cost of shipping goods as well. What should they expect to see in the weeks and months ahead?
Gas prices are going to be higher. So particularly in transportation fuels, that's gasoline, that's jet fuel, that's fuel for shipping, marine fuel, diesel, anything that's used in a large construction project or in mining, all of those things become more costly.
And even if the strait was open tomorrow, there's a downstream impact, right? What are we looking at?
That's right. But, one of the issues is that in order to restart the wells that have been shut in could take several months. This could take 3 to 4 months in the case of Kuwait, perhaps longer in Iraq. So getting back to normal is not a one-day thing. First, it's getting ships into the Strait of Hormuz, having them load, having them then exit safely, and getting that volume of traffic that we had before February 28th. And we're a long way away from that, particularly if the Strait of Hormuz has mines and we require military escorts of ships.
Getting back to the UAE here, the decision they made here to leave OPEC seemed to say they put their national interest ahead of being part of this legacy institution, which is
even in peacetime, it's going to take 6 months to clear the mines. So including these, I think we're at like a 9-month minimum, sounds like. So my estimate the other day was that we're probably locked into at least like 10, 12 months. I actually now really, we're like locked into like a year, right? Like nothing can happen today. If the best things that can possibly happen start happening today, we're still like a year out before we get back to normal. And the price shocks are going to start rippling more and more and more, like starting in like 2 weeks probably.
Told the global oil supply for 60 years now, more than that. How do you look at that decision?
The thing to take away from this is that neither party is the solution. We need to have a revolution. And, it might not be hard for people to see that Donald Trump is Untermensch over these next few weeks.